Hello and welcome to Reforge Studio Greenstuff sculpting video. Today we're going to look at how to sculpt with Greenstuff or milliput. We're going to focus mostly on the Greenstuff, but some people do like to use a mix of the two for detailing, etc. We're also going to use some tweezers, some of the mini scissors and some of the sculpting tools, although not so much of the sculpting tools today. And we will be using an element of the soft silicone sculpting tools over here on the right. Doing all of this on blank Mark III Space Marine shoulder pad, as you can see here. We're also going to use our trusty scalpel. Now, one thing to consider here is that you can use numerous lubricants for this, either Vaseline or some plain water if you so wish. For the ease of use and because it adds an amount of flexibility, we're going to focus mostly on the Vaseline sculpting tutorial. So we'll look here to move everything off to one side, and we're going to start with the Greenstuff itself. So obviously this is what we want, nice small blob of Greenstuff. This is also how we're going to get to this point, which is to separate yellow and blue stuff off the walls or previous. And as you can see here, I've separated the two. This is because sometimes you get this roll and the line here in the middle where the two join, depending on how it's been kept or how long you've had it, can start to cure, so you can end up with bits in the Greenstuff mix. That's not really something that we want too much of. So I've separated the two, cut out that middle section to cut away that dead area, and here we have a rather smooth, but stiffening as we speak, Greenstuff ball. So the idea is to try and warm it up between your fingers, and as you warm it up, you'll start to notice that it gets a bit sticky and a bit tacky, and it'll start to stick to our fingers a little bit. It'll also stick to the tools if we're not careful, and that's where the Vaseline comes in. It helps lubricate whilst maintaining a usable substance for the tutorial that we're following. In this tutorial, the thing we're going to sculpt is some fairly simple Greenstuff Fur, as we probably saw from the title. I've warmed this up a little bit, get it into a nice thin layer, but not too thin. You can see some of the bits in the middle there, which I separate and get a nice little workable ball into relatively thin patch. And you can see it's much larger than we need, but that'll become a little bit more relevant. So using some of those silicone sculpting tools, I've chosen one with a slightly rounded edge, and I'm going to just smooth it over to the shoulder pad here, and then use a knife edge sculpting tool to define the top edge, and I start to thin out the top edge a little bit in order to create a fold over the top. You might have seen on some of the sculpted fur on pre-existing models or other Greenstuff sculpting, and there's an element of the fur folding over or a certain flap on the top. That's where we're going to create this, and it looks quite rough to start with, but you don't need to worry too much about it. And we keep going back and trying to just pick out some of the detail and try and define the line a little bit more. Here we have that a bit clearer, and here we have the nail scissors that I'm going to use, as well as continuation of the knife-edged silicone tool. So here we're just going to go really roughly across the Greenstuff, making some straight lines, some cross-hatch lines, some horizontal lines. It really doesn't matter too much at this point. It's more just to add a clear idea of where we want to start making the fur tufts, how we want it to fall, how we want it to look. So again, this is all really a bit more relevant to how you want the fur to fall on the model. I add a little bit of Vaseline to the nail there so that the stuff doesn't stick to my nail and you don't have any problems in trying to remove and manipulate the item. So I go over really roughly with the silicone sculpting tool, as you can see, create some really rough lines. It doesn't really matter too much. And then what I'm going to do is go over with the knife, which has also been lubricated with some of the Vaseline, and just try to create some slight scarring, almost cuts, but not go all the way through the Greenstuff. That's really important, otherwise you'll end up pulling the surface that you've created apart and it'll kind of ruin the whole effect. So we go over just to further define where some of the elements of the fur might peak or tuft or move to one side. And again, do this really roughly, try not in too many places to go all the way through the Greenstuff, as you can see there. It's important to remember with this step as well that if you want to, you can use some Vaseline, you can use some of the flat tools to smooth the area out and go over it again. It's not going to damage anything too much at this point. Then what we want to do is take the scissors. You notice there's a slight curve to them, and we've got to add a little bit of Vaseline to it. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take the scissors and start to create slightly larger tufts than you perhaps would expect for some of the fur here. And what that's doing is that's defining some of the layering to the fur that we can see. So it creates that artificial impression that fur isn't flat. There are tufts that would, by movement, fur sculpt on, always part of the weathering effect of the thickened fur. And you can see here, starting to go into the bottom layer, I'm starting to cut a little bit deeper in some areas, and that's because the intention here is to, as you'll see in a second, pull it apart in a slightly rougher sense there. What that does is it tries to create an element weathered look so that the fur isn't perfect, it's had some environmental impacts, which has meant it's not just a perfect piece of fur, but there's an element of use to it, and it's attacked, it's been worn, it's been cut off, etc. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take the tweezers on the sections that you can see that we defined with scissors, and we're going to start to snip some slightly finer areas of fur, which again further add to that perception of depth of the fur. Just be quite random with this, there's no precise pattern that you want. When was the last time that you saw fur that was precisely straight or flat, etc. So you can be quite rough with this. And what we're trying to do is just create peaks, slightly smaller peaks than the ones that we created with the scissors, and the idea is to just do this across the whole shoulder pad. And again, don't be too worried. You notice here that there was some little bits of green stuff coming off from the tweezers, despite the fact that we've used Vaseline. That's not a problem. It shouldn't affect the overall impact of how we see the fur finished product. So I just go around the edge here, trying to create some slightly smaller tufts on the damaged section, again just to add to that perceived realism of the piece. As we come to the end of the shoulder pad here, you can start to just have a little check. You can see where you might want to see some tufts in different centres, in different depths, or in different styles. And then I just pull this extra little bit off here and carry on. So now we're at a point where you see it looks a little bit like someone's stuck their hair up, and we're just going to take one of the silicone tools here and just smooth them down a little bit. You can push them in certain directions to again add that perception of movement, and we start to just smooth off, flatten out, apply an element of weathering to fold at the top of the fur. With this silicone tool I'm just adding some folds or some lines, and again just trying to create that impression of folded leather or tanned leather, as you might see. And there we have it. It's just a little bit of tidying up, checking it out to make sure we're happy with it, and that's that. Thank you for joining our snapshot tutorial. See you next time.